Hi there, I'm Adam Nayman with another Ringer video essay. Alex Garland's new thriller Civil War, which opens this month, divides America along ideological lines. As the film opens, there's a wildly unpopular president, played in a wry bit of casting by Parks and Rec's resident libertarian sweetheart Nick Offerman, who has spent most of his third term fending off Capitol storming forces, seemingly derived from the extreme right and left wings of the country. As a meditation on contemporary political polarity, Civil War is a bit puzzling. It never explains, for instance, how or why California and Texas would secede from the country, much less join forces. But as its director has said, the film is not really meant as a political allegory. It casts itself more generally in the tradition of the post-apocalyptic thriller, a genre in which everyday reality has become warped beyond recognition, and both urban and rural spaces tremble with danger. With this in mind, we decided to count down a list of 10 movies with memorably dystopian visions, drawn from multiple decades of Hollywood history. Besides revisiting some stone-cold classics, the idea is to show that no matter how much civilization and technology change over the decades, on and off screen, certain visual and thematic ideas remain remarkably consistent. Obviously, we couldn't get to every cinematic dystopia, and we are not necessarily choosing the ones that we think are best. We did want to point out some that have endured in different ways in film history, movies that look like they are good bets to go the distance in the future, provided we all make it there in one place. When Planet of the Apes premiered in 1968, Pauline Kael wrote that its star, Charlton Heston, had the profile of an eagle. In that majestic context, his character, an astronaut named Taylor who wakes up several hundred years in the future to a dystopian society ruled by primates, was nothing less than a symbol of American exceptionalism. Hence the dark humor of seeing Heston, at that time one of Hollywood's biggest stars, stripped, beaten, gagged, humiliated, and threatened with castration by his shaggy co-stars, a kind of tour de force of abjection that sells the idea of humanity relegated to a lower position on the global food chain, while also kidding the emergent and very furry anti-war counterculture. Never trust anyone over 30, Heston tells a young chimpanzee at one point. Rod Serling's screenplay is filled with wry Darwinian jokes about evolution and survival of the fittest, and also satirical jabs at religious dogma and doctrine. In some ways, the film is the ultimate episode of The Twilight Zone. For all its comic touches, it's a grim allegory about a species' apocalyptic hubris. In one of the great endings of all time, we learn the reason Taylor feels strangely at home in this authoritarian dystopia is that, of course, he's been on Earth all along, the last man standing amidst the nuclear wreckage that constitutes our pitiful legacy. The film's success spawns sequels, rip-offs, remakes, and parodies, all of which are interesting, but none of which quite capture the potent comic book poetry of the original. After terrifying international audiences with his pioneering mockumentary The War Game, which visualized the carnage of a hypothetical nuclear strike in the United Kingdom, avant-garde provocateur Peter Watkins churned out another lean, nasty piece of future shock agitprop with Punishment Park in 1971. The title refers to a sun-blasted stretch of California desert where political prisoners and dissidents are sent to be hunted by armed National Guardsmen, a scenario the film implies was signed into action by no less than Richard Nixon, depicted here as a despot intent on holding power by any means necessary. Drawing on public knowledge of the 1968 Democratic National Convention riots and the Kent State shootings, Watkins sketched a vision of America where resistance is at once necessary and futile, employing shaky handheld camera work and largely improvised dialogue to discombobulate audiences with the nature of images in front of them. This is a movie that goes hand in hand with other verite experiments of the period like David Holtzman's Diary or Brian De Palma's Hi Mom. In lieu of broad spectacle, Punishment Park traffics in speculative realism of a kind that really hasn't dated much in 50 years. If anything, the increased skepticism and anxiety around policing in America renders the film's most shocking moments even more prophetic in retrospect. Sean Connery does his best Charlton Heston impression in John Boorman's campy sci-fi mashup, whose title contains a sneaky homage to one of the most famous fantasy movies of all time. Zardas' inspiration may lie somewhere over the rainbow, but before it gets there, the film, which came out in 1974, offers a guided tour of the future as a tacky, strobe-lit discotheque, with glittering screens facing in every direction, presided over by a cadre of joyless, sexless elites. The upper class in the film subjugates a worker class of primitive barbarians who have been manipulated to worship semi-automatic weapons. These are supplied by a spaceship styled as a floating stone head, a nod to Kubrick's Monolith that's also an outrageous sight gag out of Monty Python. When Connery's character penetrates the upper-class environment, he is not just a dangerous killer, he's also the most desirable man around, and he ends up being subject to all kinds of experiments, testing his virility. When we see him lying on the slab being probed with lasers, he might just as easily be James Bond on intergalactic assignment. To make an understatement, and this is quite an understatement, Zardoz is a ridiculous movie. It's overwrought, overstuffed, and defined by wild swings in tone and sensibility. But it's also so visually striking and richly designed that the flaws sort of fall away. Boorman, who is a fearless director, at that point coming off the success of Deliverance, fully commits to the story's dystopian mythology, and, for all the goofiness, makes it resonate on an emotional level. In risking embarrassment, Boorman achieved a kind of cult glory. No B-movie producer ever had savvier instincts than Roger Corman, who built an empire on the margins of Hollywood blockbusters. For instance, the low-budget, high-velocity Death Race 2000 brazenly recycled elements from Norman Jewison's expensive thriller Rollerball about futuristic gladiatorial sporting events. What Death Race 2000 added was a pungent mean streak, detailing America's conjoined addictions to gasoline and blood. In a future world racked by economic ruin, the ruling authorities offer bread and circuses in the form of the Transcontinental Road Race, whose participants pilot custom-tooled cars along a series of twisty, booby-trapped highways, scoring extra points for causing civilian casualties. David Carradine stars as the ruthless, enigmatic crowd favorite known as Frankenstein, who seems impervious to pain and invulnerable to destruction. His main rival is the gangsterish Machine Gun Joe, played by a pre-stardom Sylvester Stallone, whose charisma here hints at bigger things to come, i.e. Rocky the next year. Brilliantly and resourcefully directed by exploitation specialist Paul Bartel, Death Race 2000 moves too quickly for the viewer to really contemplate the more serious consequences of apocalypse, but the need for speed style would prove hugely influential. It's impossible to imagine the Mad Max series without Death Race 2000, for instance. A remake by the director Paul W.S. Anderson featuring Jason Statham tried to capture some of the original's breakneck bad taste magic, but came up short. There's a perverse streak of civic pride in John Carpenter's action classic, which turns New York City into a maximum security prison. In light of the list that we've made today, you could refer to the film as Punishment Central Park. The story is basically the Dirty Dozen divided by 12, enlisted to infiltrate the Bad Apple on a suicide mission to retrieve the President of the United States, who's been kidnapped by a violent warlord. Snake Plissken is pretty much on his own, which is how the character likes it. He's a badass played by Kurt Russell, at that point in his prime, with dirty hair, an eye patch, and a sneer. An iconic anti-hero who carries himself with some of the laconic confidence of John Wayne, right down to the lurching, cross-armed gait. Of all the great American genre filmmakers of the 80s, Carpenter is the one who is both the most unpretentious and the most adept at smuggling anti-establishment politics into exploitation movie frameworks. Escape from New York's vision of a system that uses prisoners as unpaid labor pairs nicely with the impending LA set allegory They Live as a kind of bi-coastal picaresque depicting a broken country under Ronald Reagan. The problems within the country, the places in which it's broken, are not things that Snake Plissken is interested in fixing. His self-interest has its own weird fatalistic integrity. Rather than regret that he has only one life to live for his country, he chooses in the end wisely to keep that life for himself. On the page, Stephen King's novel The Running Man was a prescient cautionary fable about the bloodthirsty potential of reality television. On screen, it's more like an R-rated version of American Gladiators, featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger in lethal one-liner mode.
One of us is in deep trouble.
This is not necessarily a bad thing. Still white hot at this point off The Terminator, Arnold is entertaining as a cash-strapped protagonist, selected to star in a Life or Death Network showcase featuring futuristic vehicles and deadly high-tech weapons. These are the tools he must master to fend off a gang of stalkers played by legit tough guys like Jesse the Body Ventura and Jim Brown, whose presences ground the film in a kind of hard-bodied authenticity. But the most important cast member, other than Arnold, is Richard Dawson, at that time the host of TV's Family Feud and a walking embodiment of game show gravitas. Dawson lends the film version of The Running Man just the right fast-talking, crowd-pleasing smarm, even as he is being dwarfed by his co-star. 10 years after Forrest Gump elevated American idiocy to a kind of godliness, Mike Judge brings things back down to earth with Idiocracy, a glimpse at the 25th century in which unfettered consumerism has reduced the national IQ to dangerously low levels. Between the slacker satire of Beavis and Butthead and the caustic white-collar commentary of Office Space, Judge has always laced his juvenilia with trenchant observations about America as a comfort zone for anti-intellectualism. In Idiocracy, stupidity has even been incentivized. Here's a world where farmers use energy drinks to fertilize plants, whose political leaders are indistinguishable from professional wrestlers. Terry Crews' President Camacho is an ex-porn star with massive biceps who doesn't so much deliver addresses as cut Hulk Hogan-style promos. The noticeably low-budget production values link Idiocracy to a long tradition of scrappy, speculative sci-fi. Judge wears his influences on his thrift store sleeves like a badge of honor. Cormac McCarthy won the Pulitzer Prize for his po-faced riff on dystopian horror, a book whose basic setup of a father and son winding their way through a blasted, dangerous landscape populated by thieves and cannibals was actually prophesied in the final passage of No Country for Old Men. Australian director John Hillcoat's adaptation hews fairly closely to its source material, and, playing a symbol of paternal perseverance, Viggo Mortensen seems to have stepped directly out of McCarthy's pages. For some, the road's achievement, both as a book and as a film, lies in how strategically it drains the pulp out of its end-of-the-world scenario, rendering it more austere than the likes of Death Race 2000 or even Mad Max. The film's refusal to clarify the exact nature of the events that led to widespread ruin is in line with McCarthy's enigmatic storytelling, but Hillcoat's images carry an unmistakable shiver of ecological upheaval. In certain scenes, the movie seems to be simultaneously visualizing a pre-industrial past and a post-human future. Modeled equally on Charlie Chaplin in E.T., the title robot of Pixar's 2008 sci-fi fairy tale patrols the garbage-strewn remains of human civilization, a lonely sentinel left behind to clean up our mess. The images, which intrude contributions from the noted cinematographer Roger Deakins, are indelible, tableaus of desolation suggesting nothing less than manufactured landscapes as shot by photographer Roger Deakins. Considering its billing as a children's movie, WALLE is remarkably grim stuff. Leavened with sentiment and slapstick comedy, the frequent homages to 2001: A Space Odyssey unlock its deftly woven themes of humanity, undone by its own technological progress. WALLE is childlike, but he's also more self-sufficient than the flesh and blood characters, who've been rendered helpless by convenience. His attempts to bring life, in the form of a green Edenic plant, back to a blasted uninhabitable Earth frames him as a genuine underdog hero. The irony of Pixar critiquing a technocratic culture of infantilization may be a little thick, but WALL-E is still a beguiling and unsettling contradiction, a mass crowd-pleasing entertainment that still stares directly into the abyss. Alfonso Cuarón's trademark traveling shots are exceptionally well suited to the flattened habitats of Children of Men, which, like WALL-E, is about an outsider trying to protect precious cargo. The hero, Theo, played by Clive Owen, is a former political radical who's employed to shepherd a young woman through a forbidding stretch of countryside, only to discover she's not a political prisoner but a biological anomaly, an expectant mother in a moment where childbirth is proven to be a scientific impossibility. Like The Road, Children of Men has been calibrated for realism rather than exploitation, and its frames are filled with harrowingly plausible images of society in irreversible decline. The long takes, meanwhile, prove Cuarón a master of real-time world-building as well as white-knuckle suspense. The centerpiece sequence during a firefight in a bombed-out apartment block combines the intensity of a combat movie with a moment of spiritual epiphany. A fragile amnesty suggesting some kind of hope for the future, and then, as it must, the shooting starts all over again. Hope that you enjoyed this list of memorable or influential dystopian movies. We wonder which ones you think we've left off our list, so you can let us know in the comments. Thanks very much. Adam Nayman for The Ringer, and we'll see you next time.